Here are the updates on the US-Iran war. For one thing, apparently it's no longer a war. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio testified to Congress that Operation Epic Fury had been wound down entirely. He said he would not call the current exchanges of fire with Iran a war. So what are those exchanges of fire? Clashes continue in the Strait of Hormuz, where both sides are imposing blockades. On Tuesday, the US military struck a Botswana-flagged oil tanker headed for Iran's Kharg island. Iran said it targeted a US vessel on Wednesday. US Central Command denied the attack. The Gulf was then hit with renewed attacks. One person was killed and over 60 injured in Iranian drone strikes on Kuwait's international airport. The airport also sustained significant damage, though Iran blamed this on a US missile interceptor gone wrong. The US denied this. Kuwait has been a frequent target for Tehran, which claims that the Gulf country has been used as a launchpad for US missiles heading its way. Kuwait maintains it has not allowed Washington to use its bases for this war. Bahrain, Jordan, Iraq, the UAE and Qatar also suffered Iranian fire. But while hostilities appear to be escalating again, Iran has acknowledged that it's back at the negotiating table with the US. This followed earlier threats of walking away over Israel's relentless bombardment of Lebanon. Trump, once more, said significant progress had been made in negotiations. Iran's foreign minister once more denied this. So here to make things make sense is Trita, Iranian analyst and vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Trita, welcome back to MEE Live. Lots to discuss. First, attacks on the Gulf. Iran's definition of proportional retaliation appears to be shifting. The US struck a tanker near Kharg Island. Iran struck Kuwait, also Bahrain, Jordan, northern Iraq, the UAE, Qatar. What happened to tit-for-tat?
Yeah, the Iranians have announced a new formula for tit-for-tat, in which they're saying that now for every tit, they will respond with 1.5 tats, essentially. They will respond 1.5 times the force of whatever the US uses against Iran. What I think happened here is that about 8 or 9 days ago, the United States started to strike at Iranian ships, and then also on the Iranian mainland, particularly in the Bandar Abbas area. And this is part of, I think, both as tightening of the blockade and escalation of it, as well as putting pressure on the Iranians to give a response back to Trump on the proposal that was on the table, that the Qataris in particular have played a very critical role mediating. There's deep frustration on the American side that the Iranians were so slow in responding, and to the best of my knowledge, they have not given a full response even yet. At first, the Iranians responded proportionately, but I think they quickly realized that that level of exchange between the US and Iran is to the benefit of the United States. It would normalize the idea that within this ceasefire, the United States can strike at Iranian ships, and the Iranians could strike back at some of the GCC countries, but it would not impose much of a cost on the US. And it would be a new normal, erode Iran's deterrence, and it would be quite beneficial to the United States. So 2 days ago, apparently, they shifted. They tried to change the equation. Suddenly, as you mentioned, they struck Kuwait, Bahrain, several other countries at the same time. And I think this was their way of saying they still have escalation dominance, and they're not going to tolerate a lower level of exchange. The reason for that is very interesting. The US and Iran would both be comfortable with some form of a deal. I think both of them are serious. Obviously, they have very different ideas of what the deal should be. But short of a deal, they have different comfort levels in terms of where this ceasefire would be. The US side, as I mentioned, would be benefiting from a lower level exchange that doesn't ruin the ceasefire, but tightens the blockade of the blockade. That's very uncomfortable for the Iranians, who are already now starting to suffer with much lower oil sales as a result of that blockade. However, the Iranians are comfortable, not delightful, I would say, but they're comfortable with a far greater escalation, in which they can actually inflict far more damage on the global economy and on the United States, whereas the United States is not at all comfortable with that level of escalation. And what we saw here was that the Iranians were saying, we're not going to tolerate your level of escalation, we're going to increase it, because we know that you're going to be uncomfortable with that. So either we both de-escalate, or there's going to be a full escalation. It will be interesting to see what the American response will be to that. What we've seen so far is that the Trump administration and Trump himself has played down the Iranian escalation. And that seems to be something he says in order to reduce pressure on himself having to respond to this. So we may see a de-escalation. It may also be just a tactical pause in which the US is regrouping and trying to determine how to take its next step. And next step may actually be a further escalation. It's unclear at this point, but the early signals from the Trump administration at least seems to appear to have paved the way for a mutual step down from this.
And the context of Trump's reaction here is that in the US, the House of Representatives has just voted in favor of measures to halt the war on Iran. 4 Republicans joined Democrats in a rare rebuke of the president. This, of course, however, may be largely symbolic. Does this matter? Is this playing in to that negotiation?
It absolutely matters. Even if this resolution at the end of the day does not tie Trump's hands legally, formally, it nevertheless shows that the patience on the Republican side supporting this war, or a lukewarm support of this war, despite the fact that no end is near, despite the fact that midterms are going to be a bloodbath for many of these Republicans. It means that now we're gotten into a territory in which enough of them are defecting to allow this to pass. Even if it doesn't formally hold Trump's hands, it's a very strong indication of how patience is running out. And this is a major political problem for Trump, despite the fact that he keeps on saying that he doesn't care about these things. That's what he has to say because he doesn't want the Iranians to think that this should embolden their position. But reality is he has to care about this issue.
Now, we keep hearing that Iran is in a stronger negotiating position today than it used to be. You talk about their escalatory power. They've certainly gained leverage in Hormuz. But as you just pointed out, this is also very, very economically devastating for Iran. And it's important to remember that before the war even began, there were mass protests triggered initially over dire economic conditions. The war is certainly protracting this. Can you bring us any update of the political and economic sentiment inside Iran? And does that damage Iran's strength at the negotiating table?
It absolutely damages Iran's strength more than anything else because it shows that Iran does not have infinite time. It was in a very dire economic situation before the war. In the first phases of the war, its economic situation in some ways improved because it sold more oil than before at a much higher price without any major discounts. But now those oil sales have gone down significantly as a result of the blockade of the blockade. But here's the problem with the blockade of the blockade. Like all other sanctions measures that the United States has imposed, the US, first of all, overestimated how quickly it would have an effect on Iran. So there was this talk that within 10 days, the Iranian economy is going to crash, all of these things. I mean, essentially, Iran's economy should have crashed a month ago, according to these estimates. Completely overestimated it. But secondly, it's also misunderstanding what Iran's response would be. Thinking that this would force the Iranians to capitulate, instead we see exactly what the response was going to be, which was always clear. If the Iranians were pushed into a corner, they would escalate in turn. And that's exactly what we saw 48 hours ago. It's that all of these things are coming together. As I mentioned earlier on, this was an effort by the US to intensify the blockade. The blockade is having an impact on the Iranian economy, and the Iranian response is to escalate in turn, not to capitulate. And this is a pattern we've seen for more than 25 years, in which the US constantly thinks that its escalatory moves are going to be some sort of a game changer that forces Iran to capitulate, and none of them have so far proven to be that. But it does mean Iran does not have an infinite amount of time. It also means it's very important for the Iranians to get an end to the war in a manner that enables them to manage the internal situation afterwards. If they don't have sanctions relief, if they don't get a lot of release of their own funds right away, they're going to have challenges managing the internal situation because right now, the population, as a result of the war, is not expressing or manifesting their opposition through protests, etc. But once the war is over, it's very likely to go back to that, given how bad the economic situation is. So I think from the Iranian standpoint, it's a security issue for them to get as much of their frozen assets released as quickly as possible during the stage of the MOU.
And Trita, we're keen for your thoughts on this comment from Donald Trump when asked about Iran's new supreme leader.
Would you like to meet him or meet any of the Iranians in person?
I've never thought of it, actually. It's a very good question. I'll think of it. Yeah, I'd like to meet him. I like to meet everybody. I'd like to meet him. We probably will meet at some point.
Now, Mujtaba Khamenei has not been seen in public since US-Israeli airstrikes at the start of the war killed his father, mother, wife, sister, and left him injured. Do you see Khamenei taking Trump up on this offer someday?
I find it extremely unlikely that there ever will be such a meeting between Mujtaba Khamenei and Trump. I'm not surprised at all that Trump is willing to meet. He's made it very clear, unlike previous presidents that allowed political constraints to diminish their ability to directly engage with foreign leaders, even the ones that they deeply despised or disliked. Trump has not been like that. He's met with Shara, he's met with Kim Jong-un. He has none of these different problems. And in fact, the conversations between the United States and Russia dramatically increased once he came into office because he didn't have a problem talking to Putin, unlike Biden. But I don't think the Iranians will respond in that manner of having Mujtaba meet with him. However, I find it quite likely that at some point there is a meeting and even a public meeting, if there is a deal between a senior Iranian official and a senior American official, and it might be Trump himself, but it won't be Mujtaba Khamenei on the Iranian side.